In the spring of 1933, just a few weeks after Adolf Hitler came to power, there were already approximately 100 improvised detention sites in German territory. Basements of SA barracks, abandoned factories, medieval castles, and repurposed youth hostels. One of these, the Mauthausen camp, set up in an old factory along the railway line between Mainz and Worms, bore a monumental inscription on its facade: Konzentrationslager Mauthausen. Any train passenger could read it. Terror was not hidden, it was displayed. What began as a fragmented network of police improvisation turned over 12 years into a system that covered practically the entire European continent. By 1944, the formal system of concentration camps, supervised by the Concentration Camp Inspectorate based in Oranienburg, included 25 main camps and over 1,000 subcamps. The total number of Nazi detention facilities exceeds 30,000 documented sites. Auschwitz, the factory. The name Auschwitz comes from the small Polish town of Oświęcim in Upper Silesia at the confluence of the Vistula and Soa rivers. When German troops occupied the town in September 1939, they renamed it and began planning the use of its facilities. The first use was the most obvious. The red brick barracks of the former Polish army garrison offered a solid infrastructure. On June 14, 1940, the first transport arrived. 728 Polish prisoners, mostly students, intellectuals, and early resistance members, from the Tarnow prison. Upon arrival, the camp was not even completed. The prisoners built their own prison. SS Hauptsturmführer Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss, 38 years old, was appointed commander. Höss had served a prison sentence for murder in the Weimar Republic. The crime had been part of a vigilante action within nationalist circles before joining the SS in 1934 and methodically rising through the Dachau and Sachsenhausen camp system. He arrived at Auschwitz in May 1940 with instructions to build a camp for 10,000 prisoners. Within 3 years, the complex he managed would have a capacity tens of times that number. The Stammlager, Auschwitz I, retained the brick structures of the Polish garrison and remodeled them according to the Dachau model. Prisoners, numbered with the colored triangle corresponding to their category, red for political prisoners, yellow for Jews, pink for homosexuals, black for asocials, brown for Roma, were distributed across 28 blocks. Block 11 became the punishment within punishment. In its basements, standing cells, 4 people confined in a space of 90 by 90 centimeters, unable to sit, were used for interrogations and punishments of indefinite duration. In the courtyard between blocks 10 and 11, the black wall of execution, a wall of wooden planks covered with cork to absorb bullets, was the scene of thousands of summary executions, mostly of Poles accused of resistance activities. The first Zyklon B gas test at Auschwitz took place in the basement of Block 11 on the night of September 3rd to 4th, 1941, on 600 Soviet prisoners and 250 sick prisoners selected from the camp hospital. Höss described the operation in his memoirs with technical detail and without any appreciable emotional record. Auschwitz II-Birkenau was the expansion that transformed the complex into the largest concentration and extermination camp of the Nazi system. The chosen site was 3 kilometers west of the main camp, on the outskirts of the village of Brzezinka. It was swampy land with a high water table, which in winter became a quagmire and in summer emitted gases from the ground. Prisoners who worked on preparing the land and building the first barracks in the winter of 1941 to 1942 died at a rate that astonished even the SS administrators accustomed to high mortality rates. The first barracks at Birkenau were Prussian army stables, prefabricated wooden structures designed for 52 horses converted into human accommodations without substantial modification. The wooden platforms serving as bunk beds, 3 levels high, each level 180 centimeters wide, theoretically housed 3 people. In practice, they housed 6, 8 or more. There were no mattresses. There were not enough blankets. Gaps between the planks allowed the piercing Polish winter wind to pass through, with temperatures often dropping below 20 degrees Celsius below zero. There were no floors either. The ground, with the swampy terrain's moisture, remained muddy most of the year. In the first months of Birkenau's operation, mortality among Soviet war prisoners housed there exceeded 90% in less than 3 months. The Birkenau complex was eventually divided into multiple sections called Lagerabschnitte, with different functions and populations. a section for men, another for women, the Czech family camp, the gypsy camp, Zigeunerlager, and the quarantine depot. Canada, the area for storing goods confiscated from deportees, occupied two enormous warehouses in the far northwest of the camp filled with clothes, suitcases, prosthetics, glasses, toys, non-perishable food, and valuable items seized. Members of the Canada Commando working there had access to extra food and valuable items, a position of relative privilege that made them outcasts to the rest of the prisoner population and the object of systematic envy, as described by Tadeusz Borowski in his account of the ramp. The Birkenau railway ramp, specifically built in the summer of 1944 within the camp perimeter to facilitate mass arrivals from Hungary, was the scene of selection. Before its construction, transports arrived at an external ramp several kilometers from the crematoria, and prisoners had to walk that distance on foot. The new internal ramp reduced the time between arrival and death to less than 2 hours. In the spring and summer of 1944, when more than 430,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz, the largest flow of deportations of the entire war, sometimes 3 or 4 trains arrived per day. SS doctors took turns in the selection process in rotating shifts, often for hours under the sun or rain. SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. Josef Mengele, who arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943, was known to appear voluntarily at the ramp beyond his assigned shift. He appeared with white gloves and immaculate uniform, whistling opera fragments, according to multiple survivor testimonies, including that of prisoner Dr. Miklos Nisli, who worked as a forced assistant in Mengele's autopsies. The 4 crematoria of Birkenau, Crematorien 2, 3, 4, and 5, were designed by the company Topf und Söhne of Erfurt, specialized in industrial cremation ovens. The correspondence between Topf engineers, including Kurt Prüfer, who personally supervised the installations, and the Auschwitz SS has been preserved and thoroughly studied. In it, the engineers discuss, in a professional tone, technical problems of the gas extraction systems, the performance of the ovens in relation to the type of available fuel, and improvements that could increase processing capacity. Crematorien 2 and 3 were the largest. Each had 5 ovens with 3 chambers each, with a theoretical cremation capacity of 1,440 corpses in 24 hours. Crematorien 4 and 5 had a smaller capacity. In total, the combined theoretical capacity of the 4 crematoria exceeded 4,700 bodies per day. In practice, the pace of arrivals during the summer of 1944 even exceeded that capacity, forcing the SS to dig open pits for direct cremation next to the crematoria. The gas chambers of Crematorien 2 and 3, the so-called Leichenkeller, corpse basements according to official documentation, could accommodate approximately 2,000 people each. The gas used was Zyklon B, hydrogen cyanide on a granular support manufactured by Degesch under license from IG Farben, which was introduced through openings in the ceiling once the metal doors were closed and sealed. Death by inhalation of Zyklon B at the concentrations used in Auschwitz occurred between 2 and 15 minutes after the gas was introduced, depending on the number of people and the amount of gas used. Members of the Sonderkommando, prisoners, mostly Jews forced under threat of immediate death to work in the process, removed the corpses, searched for valuables in mouths, ears, and body cavities, extracted gold teeth, shaved the hair of dead women, and transported the bodies to the ovens. They lived in a separate sector of the camp, isolated from the rest of the prisoner population, knowing they themselves would be killed and periodically replaced to eliminate witnesses. On October 7, 1944, the members of the Sonderkommando revolted. They had accumulated explosives secretly supplied by workers from a nearby armaments factory, including Rosa Robota, Regine Saphirstein, Alla Gertner, and Estera Weichblum, with which they partially blew up Crematorium 4. 3 SS guards died in the uprising. The retaliation was immediate. The 4 women who provided the explosives were arrested, tortured for weeks, and publicly hanged in January 1945. All Sonderkommando members who participated in the uprising were executed. Only a small number managed to temporarily escape outside. Auschwitz III, Monowitz, also known as Buna, was established in 1942 to house prisoners working in the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant, located several kilometers from the main camp. IG Farben had deliberately chosen the location of its plant in the Auschwitz region due to the availability of slave labor and proximity to raw materials. The company paid the SS between 4 and 6 Reichsmarks per day per prisoner, depending on skill level. The prisoners received nothing. Nobel Prize-winning chemist Primo Levi, who arrived at Monowitz in February 1944 from Italy, described the camp in his work, "If this is a man with precision that complements and humanizes the administrative data, the internal hierarchy among prisoners, survival mechanisms, the bartering system through which some obtained extra rations, and the progressive dehumanization process designed by the system to make prisoners incapable of organized resistance." From Monowitz, at least 40 additional subcamps were administered, distributed across industrial and mining facilities in Upper Silesia. Auschwitz as an industrial hub was the most ambitious project of the WVHA, a concentration city integrated into the Reich's war economy, with agricultural production on nearby SS experimental farms, coal extraction in the region's mines, chemical production at the Buna plant, and replaceable slave labor nearly unlimited thanks to the proximity of extermination centers. Rudolf Höss was relieved of command of Auschwitz in November 1943, promoted to head of the concentration camp inspectorate, and replaced by Arthur Liebehenschel. He was recalled to Auschwitz in May 1944 specifically to oversee the extermination of Hungarian Jews, internally called Sonderaktion Ungarn. He returned as a specialist for the largest operation in the camp's history. After the war, captured by the British and extradited to Poland, he was tried in Warsaw, convicted and executed by hanging on the grounds of Auschwitz on April 16, 1947. The gallows were installed next to crematorium, one of the Stammlager, a few meters from the bunker where he had lived for years. Treblinka, the place of no return. The road that today leads from the village of Treblinka to the Masovian pine forest has no signs. A traveller who does not know exactly what they are looking for can pass by without noticing it. The terrain is flat, covered with second-generation forest. The pines were planted by the SS themselves in 1943 to hide the camp. And in winter, when the snow covers the ground and the silence is absolute, it is hard to imagine that in that very spot, between July 1942 and August 1943, there was the deadliest place on earth. Treblinka II, so called to distinguish it from Treblinka I, an earlier forced labor camp located 5 kilometers away, was built in the spring and summer of 1942 under the direction of SS Hauptsturmführer Richard Thomalla, head of the construction team for Operation Reinhard. Thomalla used labor from Treblinka I for the construction. The prisoners from Treblinka I who worked on the extermination camp were killed after the construction was completed to eliminate witnesses. The basic facilities were ready in about 4 weeks. The first transport arrived on July 23, 1942. The train came from Warsaw, carrying deportees from the Warsaw Ghetto. That day marked the beginning of the Gross Action Warschau, the mass deportation of the largest ghetto in Europe. The first commander, SS Obersturmführer Irmfried Ebel, was a medical doctor by profession and had previously managed gas extermination facilities under the Action T4 program, the program for killing people with physical and mental disabilities, in the facilities at Brandenburg an der Havel and Bernburg. Ebel proved incapable of managing the scale of operations to which Treblinka was subjected from its opening. Trains arrived before the corpses from the previous transport had been removed. Bodies piled up in the open, decomposing under the heat of the Polish summer. The stench was noticeable in the surrounding villages. The Ukrainian guards themselves, recruited from Soviet prisoners of war at the SS training camp in Troniki, began to get massively drunk. The administrative chaos reached the ears of Odilo Globoknik in Lublin and his superior, SS Obergruppenführer Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger. Ebel was dismissed in August 1942, just 6 weeks after the camp opened. He was the only commander of an extermination camp removed for incompetence in managing the killings. He survived the war and was arrested in 1948, but he committed suicide before being tried. His replacement, SS Obersturmführer Franz Stangl, arrived from Sobibor, where he had already served as commander. He was a career policeman. He had served in the Austrian Gestapo before the Anschluss. Methodical, orderly, efficient. He transformed Treblinka into what he himself described at his 1970 trial as a factory. Years later, journalist Gitta Serini conducted a series of interviews with Stangl in Düsseldorf prison, published in 1974 under the title Into That Darkness. Stangl described his approach to Treblinka with a dissociation that the historian found more chilling than any expression of sadism. He spoke of the prisoners as cargo, of the ramp as a discharge point, of the efficiency of the process in the same language a factory manager might use to describe an optimized assembly line. The architecture of deception at Treblinka was the first detail that caught the attention of later investigators. The deportees arrived at a small railway station designed to look normal, a ticket office with fake train schedules painted on the wall, signs pointing to non-existent destinations like Białystok or Brest-Litovsk, flower beds on the platform. The station master, a prisoner forced to play the role, wore a railway uniform. The fiction lasted only long enough for the newcomers to get off the wagons, leave their luggage on the platform, and form into groups for a process they had been told was disinfection before being transferred to labor camps in the east. The real process began at that moment. Men and women were separated. Men were ordered to undress in the outdoor area. Women were taken to barracks where selected prisoners, under threat of death, cut the hair of the newcomers with large scissors. The hair was packed in jute bales and sent to Germany, where it was used as material for industrial cloth, mattress stuffing, and, according to documentation recovered in the Nuremberg trials, to make socks for submarine machinists. Gold teeth were extracted. Valuables were confiscated. Then came the Schlauch, 4 meters wide, between 100 and 150 meters long, flanked by wire fencing intertwined with pine branches to prevent visibility from outside or inside. A packed earth corridor leading uphill to the gas chambers. The Ukrainian guards pushed people through the Schlauch with blows. The noise, screams, cries, the sound of boots on the ground, was constant during operations. Prisoners working in the outer area of the camp, in the so-called lower camp or Unterlager, could hear it. Some described this sound as the most unbearable part of their existence. The original gas chambers at Treblinka were 3 contiguous concrete rooms with walls 60 to 80 centimeters thick with airtight iron doors. The system used carbon monoxide produced by a Soviet tank engine, a captured diesel engine, according to the most detailed testimonies, located in an exterior shed. The gas was introduced through pipes into the floors of the chambers. The initial capacity was about 600 to 700 people per operation, although in practice people were compressed to the physical limit of the space. The testimonies of Sonderkommando survivor Henrik Reichmann described the sound heard from outside the chambers, a collective buzzing that gradually died out over 20 to 30 minutes, as the detail that lingered most in his memory decades later. In September 1942, Stangl ordered the construction of new gas chambers to increase capacity. The new facilities consisted of 10 chambers with a common entrance from a central corridor, internally called the bathhouse building, with signs on the doors reading Duschraum, shower room, with a combined capacity of approximately 3,800 to 4,000 people per operation. With the new facilities, Treblinka could kill and process in a single day what had previously taken several days over weeks. The process of eliminating evidence began in March 1943, when Heinrich Himmler visited Treblinka and ordered the exhumation and cremation of all bodies buried in the large mass graves. Estimates suggest that at that time there were between 700,000 and 800,000 corpses in the graves. The exhumation work was carried out by Sonderkommando prisoners for months in advanced stages of decay. The bodies were cremated on large grates built from railroad tracks, iron grates on which layers of bodies and firewood were alternated. The ashes were crushed and mixed with soil and sand, then buried again in the graves. The operation, internally called Sonderkommando 1005, was carried out in parallel at all extermination camps as part of the evidence elimination policy known as Action 1005. The uprising on August 2, 1943, was the result of months of clandestine organization among the Treblinka Sonderkommando prisoners. The organizing committee, led by the Czech doctor Julius Korazicki, who died in April 1943 during an SS interrogation before seeing his plan carried out, and later by Zelimir Bloch and Polish soldier Stanisław Kohn, had accumulated weapons, pistols obtained by bribing Ukrainian guards and money taken from deportees' confiscated belongings. and had devised a plan to attack the camp personnel, set fire to the facilities, and flee into the forest. The plan involved about 700 prisoners. At the time of execution, coordination partially failed. The attack was premature and disorganized, but sufficient to kill several guards, set fire to warehouses and part of the barracks, and allow several hundred prisoners to escape through openings in the fence. The SS and Ukrainian guards immediately started the pursuit. Most of the escapees were captured and executed in the following days. Of the approximately 300 who reached the forest, it is estimated that between 40 and 70 survived the war. Stangl was captured in Brazil in 1967, extradited to West Germany, and tried before the Regional Court of Düsseldorf. The trial began on May 11, 1970, and concluded on December 22 of the same year with a life sentence. Stangl died of heart failure in Düsseldorf prison on June 28, 1971, 16 hours after giving his last interview to Gitta Sereny. In that final conversation, according to Sereny, he admitted for the first time, with evident reluctance, that his victims had been human beings and that he was guilty. Sereny wrote that those words seemed to cost him something he could not bear. The Treblinka camp was demolished by the SS themselves between August and November 1943. The land was ploughed and planted with pines. A farm was established there, managed by a Ukrainian named Strebel, hired to maintain the appearance of normal agricultural use. Soviet and Polish researchers who arrived at the site in 1944 found seemingly untouched land, but the soil continued to filter ashes, bone fragments, and personal items after every heavy rain. The ground of Treblinka has never stopped speaking. Has Sobibor, Belzec, and Chelmno, the invisible centers. There are names that the world took decades to learn to pronounce: Belzec, Sobibor, Chelmno. Treblinka was the largest, the most documented, the one that had enough survivors to construct a coherent narrative. The other three, pure extermination centers of Operation Reinhard, operated with lethal efficiency that left almost no witnesses. Belzec was the first to operate and produced the fewest survivors of all. It is estimated that no more than 2 or 3 people survived out of the 430,000 to 500,000 who passed through its gas chambers. This is not hyperbole. It is the documented number. Belzec was built in the town of the same name in southeastern Poland, near the border with occupied Ukraine, on an existing railway line that allowed access from the north and south. Construction began in November 1941, under the direct supervision of SS Hauptsturmführer Christian Wirth, who would later oversee the entirety of Operation Reinhard and was nicknamed by his subordinates Christian the Savage, der Wilde Christian. The camp began operations on March 17, 1942. Its first official commander was SS Obersturmführer Gottlieb Hering, although Wirth personally oversaw the initial operations. The first gas chambers at Belzec were 3 wooden rooms with walls lined with tar paper. The gas introduction system, carbon monoxide from a diesel engine, identical to the system that would later be used at Treblinka, repeatedly failed in the first weeks of operation. Wirth, who witnessed at least one failed operation in which people remained alive inside the chambers for over an hour while the engine refused to start, ordered the complete reconstruction of the facilities in concrete with improved systems. The new chambers, inaugurated in May 1942, had 6 rooms with a combined capacity of approximately 1,200 people per operation. From that moment on, deportations accelerated dramatically. The only detailed testimony from inside Belzec's operations that survived the war was that of SS Obersturmführer Kurt Gerstein, head of the SS Disinfection Service, who arrived at the camp in August 1942 with a shipment of Zyklon B, which was not used at Belzec, where carbon monoxide continued to be employed, and witnessed a full extermination operation. Gerstein prepared several detailed reports on what he saw, intended to alert the Allied powers and the Vatican through diplomatic contacts. The Apostolic Nuncio in Berlin refused to meet with him. The Swedish diplomat Göran von Otter, whom Gerstein approached on a night train and recounted what he had witnessed, transmitted the information to Stockholm, where it was archived without further action. Gerstein was arrested in 1945 by French forces and died in Fresnes prison near Paris, under unclear circumstances, in July 1945. His report was presented as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. The only documented survivor with extensive testimony about Belzec was Rudolf Raeder, born in 1881 in Galicia, a soap merchant in Luau. He arrived at Belzec in August 1942 and was selected for the Sonderkommando due to his physical condition. He worked in the camp for 3 months before managing to escape during a transfer to Luau to collect construction materials. Raeder dictated his testimony in Krakow in 1944 to the historian Nella Rost, and it was published in 1946 under the title Belzec. It is one of the most disturbing documents in all Holocaust testimonial literature, not for its rhetoric. Raeder wrote with the same dry precision of a man describing technical facts, but for its content. He described the extermination process, the behavior of the guards, the sounds coming from the chambers, and the daily routine of the Sonderkommando with the detail of someone who lived it and could not forget it. Raeder later emigrated to Israel. He died in Tel Aviv in 1977. Belzec was closed in December 1942, when most of the Jewish population of the general government in the southeastern zone had already been exterminated. The SS then proceeded to systematically destroy evidence. The barracks were demolished, the gas chambers blown up, and the land ploughed and sown. On the grounds of the former camp, a farm was built, whose manager, a Ukrainian, was instructed to maintain the appearance of agricultural use. Farmers from the surrounding area looted the soil of the former camp for years in search of valuables that deportees may have hidden, disturbing in the process the ashes and bone fragments that the land continued to return with each rainy season. Sobibor was built between February and April 1942 in a forest on the banks of the Bug River in the Lublin district, on a single-track railway line connecting Chelmno to the west and Wardawa to the north. The site was deliberately chosen for its isolation. The surrounding forest blocked visibility from the nearest villages, and the single-track railway limited traffic to the camp transports. The first commander was SS Obersturmführer Franz Stangl, the same who would later be transferred to Treblinka, who oversaw the initial phase of construction and startup. Sobibor's extermination system was technically identical to Belzec's, gas chambers with carbon monoxide from diesel engines. The difference lay in the organization of the camp, which Stangl had structured into 3 functionally separate zones: the Vorlager, with administrative facilities and staff housing; Lager 1, with barracks for Sonderkommando prisoners who performed handicraft work for the camp's use; and Lager 3, the extermination area itself, hermetically separated from the rest and accessed only by members of the gas chamber Sonderkommando. This secrecy was deliberate. Stangl wanted even prisoners working in the previous zones to be unaware of what was happening in Lager 3. The deception operated in layers. Stangl's successor in command of Sobibor from September 1942 was SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Reichleitner, who continued operations until the October 1943 uprising. Among the most documented figures of the camp staff was SS Oberscharführer Johann Niemann, whose collection of personal photographs, discovered in 2020 by researchers at the Holocaust and Genocide Center in Amsterdam at a German flea market, revealed for the first time images of the camp in operation, including photos of SS personnel and Ukrainian guards engaged in everyday activities near the camp. Niemann died during the uprising on October 14, 1943. The Sobibor uprising was the most successful of any Nazi extermination camp, and its planning represents one of the most extraordinary episodes of armed Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. Red Army Lieutenant Alexander Aronovich Pechersky, captured in October 1941 and transferred to Sobibor in September 1943, along with a group of Soviet prisoners of war, established contact with the camp's clandestine resistance committee led by Polish jeweler Leon Feldhendler. The plan developed between them was almost military in precision. Prisoners would individually summon SS officers under plausible pretexts, measuring a coat, inspecting a shoemaking task, checking a facility, and quietly kill them with axes and knives within a 90-minute window before the other guards noticed the absences. They would then cut the telephone lines and attack the armory. The plan was executed on October 14, 1943, starting at 3:30 p.m. 11 SS officers were killed during the individual summons phase, including Deputy Commander Johann Niemann. When chaos erupted, several hundred prisoners ran toward the fence. Many died in the minefields surrounding the camp, a circumstance underestimated by the organizing committee. Of the 550 to 600 prisoners present in the camp that day, approximately 300 managed to cross the fence. The SS and auxiliary police launched an immediate pursuit that lasted weeks. Most of the fugitives were captured and executed. About 50 survived the war, including Pechersky, who rejoined the Red Army and fought until the end of the conflict. Chelmno, called Kulmhof in German, was the first extermination center of the Nazi regime to begin operations, and its functioning was technically different from all the others. It did not use fixed gas chambers, it used gas trucks, Gaswagen, closed vehicles whose cargo compartments were filled with engine exhaust gas while the vehicle was in motion. Chelmno was built in the village of the same name in the Reichsgau Wartheland, the Polish region directly annexed to the Reich, on the banks of the Ner River, about 50 kilometers northwest of Łódź. The first commander was SS Hauptsturmführer Herbert Lange, who had previously led a mobile killing unit, the Sonderkommando Lang, that used gas trucks to kill patients in psychiatric hospitals in the region between 1940 and 1941. Victims arrived by truck or small trains from villages in the Wartheland and later from the Łódź ghetto. Upon arriving at the courtyard of the Chelmno Manor, an 18th-century mansion that served as the camp's main building, they were informed that they would be transferred to labor camps and were required to shower and leave their valuables. Led to the basement of the manor, they ascended a wooden ramp directly into the sealed interior of the gas truck. The vehicle traveled the 5 kilometers to the Rzeszów forest while the people inside died. In the forest, the bodies were unloaded by Sonderkommando prisoners and buried in pits. Later, from 1942 onward, they were exhumed and cremated on open-air pyres. Chelmno operated in 2 phases. The first from December 1941 to March 1943, when it was temporarily dismantled. The second from June to August 1944, when it was reactivated to liquidate the last inhabitants of the Łódź ghetto. In the second phase, the manor had been demolished and operations were moved to a concrete structure in the Rzeszów forest. The number of Chelmno's victims is a subject of historiographical debate. Estimates range from 150,000 to 340,000 people, depending on how surviving partial records and demographic calculations of the Jewish population of Wartheland are counted. What is not in dispute is that among all these people, only 2 survived with documented testimony, Michał Podślebnik and Simon Srebrenik, both members of the Sonderkommando who managed to escape at different times. Srebrenik, who had arrived at the camp as a 13-year-old boy, he sang songs while working, which made him useful as entertainment for the SS guards, was found with a gunshot wound to the head and presumed dead by the SS when Chelmno was evacuated in January 1945. He survived and returned to Chelmno in 1979 to participate in the filming of Claude Lanzmann's documentary Shoah. His words in front of the camera, standing in the field where he had worked as a child, belong to some of the most devastating moments in documentary film history. Mauthausen, Granite and Death. The Mauthausen concentration camp was established in August 1938, shortly after the annexation of Austria, on the outskirts of the small town of Mauthausen in Upper Austria, on the banks of the Danube. The reason for its location was its proximity to the Wiener Graben granite quarries, whose stone was intended for the monumental reconstruction of Berlin and Linz as part of the regime's architectural plans. Mauthausen was classified as a Grade 3 camp, the harshest category of the SS system, which meant it was intended for prisoners considered irrecoverable, the incurable enemies of the Reich. Working conditions in the quarries were deliberately lethal. Prisoners had to carry granite blocks weighing up to 50 kilograms up the 186 steps of what became known as the Stairs of Death. Those who fell or were pushed by the guards were crushed against the rock. In the early years, the guards organized games. They forced prisoners to run up the steps, and the slowest were pushed off the top of the quarry, a 45-meter cliff that prisoners called the parachutists. Bodies at the bottom took days to be collected. The Gusen subcamp, just 3 kilometers from Mauthausen, eventually matched the main camp in size. Together, Mauthausen and Gusen formed the deadliest complex in Western Europe. The mortality rate between 1940 and 1942 reached, in some periods, 70% of the inmate population. Mauthausen had more than 60 subsidiary camps in Austria. One of the most documented, Abensee, in the south of the country on the shores of Lake Trancy, was built to house underground missile production. Prisoners hand-dug tunnels in the limestone of the Salzkammergut Mountains. Conditions in the tunnels, constant temperature of 8 degrees Celsius, extreme humidity, lack of ventilation, limestone dust that destroyed lungs, killed workers within a few weeks. The Ebensee camp was liberated on May 6, 1945 by the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment of the U.S. Army. Soldiers found the survivors in a state of extreme starvation. Ravensbruck, the women's camp. 90 kilometers north of Berlin on the shore of Lake Schwet in the municipality of Fürstenberg in the forested region of Mecklenburg, the SS built between 1938 and 1939 the main concentration camp for women in the Nazi system. Ravensbruck was inaugurated on May 15, 1939, with the arrival of 867 prisoners from Lichtenberg, the previous women's camp located in a Renaissance castle in Prettin on the banks of the Elbe. The Lichtenberg camp, where Lena Haag had been before 1939, was then transformed into a men's camp. The first commander of the Ravensbruck Guards was SS Oberaufseherin Johanna Langefeld, who was replaced in 1943 and later escaped from her cell during the post-war trial. The overall command of the camp was exercised by successive commanders, the longest-serving of whom was SS Sturmbannführer Fritz Sören, who led the camp from 1942 until its chaotic evacuation in 1945. The original camp was designed for 6,000 inmates. The brick barracks, arranged in parallel rows, had windows and were equipped with basic sanitary facilities. This distinguished Ravensbruck from the camps in the east, where physical conditions were incomparably worse from the very first day. But the scale of arrivals exceeded all expectations. By 1944, Ravensbruck housed between 45,000 and 50,000 women in facilities designed for 1/10 of that number. The barracks were overcrowded to the point of collapse. Tents were installed inside the perimeter to accommodate the excess population. The latrines, already insufficient under normal circumstances, became constant sources of infection. Typhus, tuberculosis and dysentery spread uncontrollably. The medical entrance examinations, which in the early years served to record the prisoner's health status, from 1943 onward became a formality with no practical effect on the care of the sick. The prisoners of Ravensbruck represented an extraordinarily heterogeneous population. Based on surviving admission records, researchers have been able to identify women from over 40 nationalities. Polish women constituted the largest national group, approximately 40,000 over the 6 years of operation. They were followed in number by Soviet, French, German and Jewish women of various nationalities. The camp also housed Roma women, referred to in SS administrative language as Zigeunerinnen, Jehovah's Witnesses, lesbians detained under paragraph 175b, women convicted for sexual relations with foreign forced laborers and Soviet prisoners of war whose legal status within the camp system was particularly ambiguous and whose situation was generally the most precarious. The SS guards, the Aufseherinnen, were civilian women recruited through newspaper ads describing the positions as jobs in penal institutions or re-education centers, including salary, housing and meals. The training they received at Ravensbruck lasted 3 months and included instruction on camp procedures, handling German shepherd dogs assigned to higher-ranking guards, and internalizing the SS doctrine regarding prisoners as enemies of the state. Ravensbruck was the main training center for female guards in all the women's camps of the system. From here came the Aufseherinnen, who were later sent to Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Majdanek, and the subsidiary camps of Dachau and Neuengamme. The total number of guards who passed through Ravensbruck is estimated at around 3,500. Only a small percentage were tried after the war. Forced labor at Ravensbruck took various forms over the years. Prisoners worked in internal sewing facilities, making SS uniforms and clothing for the Wehrmacht. At the Siemens and Halske factory, established next to the camp in 1942, producing radio parts and electronic components for military use, and on surrounding farms and construction sites. Siemens paid the SS a daily fee for each prisoner employed. The conditions in the factory, though harsh, were considered relatively preferable to outdoor work in winter. Assignment to the Siemens factory became one of the relative privileges for which prisoners competed and negotiated through the complex internal influence mechanisms of the camp. Medical experiments conducted at Ravensbruck between 1942 and 1943 are among the best documented chapters of the camp, thanks to testimonies presented at the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946 to 1947. The scientific director was SS Brigade Führer Dr. Karl Gebhardt, personal surgeon of Himmler and director of the SS sanatorium in Hohenleichen, located a few kilometers from the camp. Gebhardt had been informally accused by some colleagues of failing to provide sulfonamides to Reinhard Heydrich after the assassination attempt in Prague in June 1942, which may have hastened the Reich protector's death. To demonstrate that sulfonamides were ineffective on infected wounds and justify himself, Gebhardt obtained Himmler's authorization to perform experiments directly on Ravensbruck prisoners. The experimental procedure was systematic. Selected prisoners, mostly young Polish women detained for resistance activities, were given leg incisions without anesthesia or with insufficient anesthesia. The wounds were then deliberately contaminated with bacteria, streptococci, Clostridium perfringens, causing gas gangrene, Clostridium tetani, causing tetanus, and in some cases with wood splinters, glass, sawdust, or dirt to replicate the conditions of shrapnel wounds in combat. Blood circulation was cut off at both ends of the wound using ligatures to simulate tissue isolation in a war injury. Sulfonamides and other drugs were administered to these infected wounds in various doses and combinations to evaluate their effectiveness. Prisoners who survived the infection were subjected to new series of experiments. Those who died, and many did, were replaced. Prisoners who survived the experiments referred to themselves as Kaninchen, rabbits, or guinea pigs. Several of them testified at Nuremberg. Jadwiga Dzido showed the court the permanent scars on her leg, while a medical expert explained the nature of the procedures she underwent in November 1942. Władysława Karolewska described the selection of victims, summoned to the infirmary without prior explanation, and the operation itself carried out without their consent and often without sufficient anesthesia. The Kaninchen had drafted a protest document during the war addressed to the camp commander, which was ignored. Some tried to hide during selections for later experiments, distributing photographs of already operated prisoners' scars to new arrivals as a warning. Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, a 29-year-old civilian dermatologist who had responded to a newspaper ad seeking a doctor for a facility near Berlin, was the only woman tried at the Nuremberg doctors' trial. Oberhäuser worked at Ravensbruck from 1941 under Gebhardt's orders and gradually assumed duties beyond those described in her initial contract. During her time at the camp, she selected subjects for experimentation, assisted in operations, monitored the wounds, often deliberately worsening the infection to study its progression, and administered lethal gasoline injections to prisoners whose experimental wounds had not healed properly or who were too weak to continue being useful. Gebhardt and his assistant Fritz Fischer were sentenced to death and executed in June 1948. Oberhäuser was sentenced to 20 years in prison. She was released in 1952 and resumed practicing medicine in West Germany until her patients discovered her history, and she was permanently barred from practice in 1960. Beyond the sulfonamide and bone experiments, Ravensbruck was also the site of sterilization experiments. SS gynecologist Karl Klauberg, who conducted his main experiments at Auschwitz, also used Ravensbruck facilities to test mass sterilization methods via intrauterine injections of caustic substances, iodine and silver nitrate in varying concentrations, which caused progressive inflammation and scarring of the fallopian tubes. The stated objective was to develop a procedure that would allow thousands of women to be sterilized in a single day of medical work. Klauberg was captured by the Soviets in 1945, tried in the USSR in 1948, and sentenced to 25 years of forced labor. Released in 1955 as part of a diplomatic exchange, he returned to West Germany and began making boastful public statements about his research. He was arrested again in 1955, but died before being tried. In the final months of the camp's operation, starting in the winter of 1944 to 1945, the SS installed a gas chamber inside the compound, a structure built while the camp was still fully operational, and began systematically killing prisoners who were too weak to work. The selection mechanism for the gas chamber replicated that of Auschwitz. Medical examinations in which prisoners in the worst physical condition were separated and sent to a special barrack from which they were then transferred to the chamber. Survivor testimonies indicate that some prisoners recognized the pattern of the selections and tried to appear stronger than they were, walking upright, pinching their cheeks for color during the examinations. The camp was liberated by the Red Army on April 30th, 1945. The SS had already evacuated most of the prisoners on marches westward from the beginning of the month. Many died during these marches. The Schmelt system and the Jewish labor camps. There is a dimension of the camp system that popular historiography barely mentions. Between 1940 and 1943, in Silesia and the Sudetes, SS Obergruppenführer Albrecht Schmelt, appointed Special Commissioner of the Reichsführer SS for the employment of foreign labor in Upper Eastern Silesia, built and operated a parallel system of 177 forced labor camps for Jews. The Schmelt organization was a peculiar enterprise even within the SS universe. Schmelt rented out prisoners to private companies and retained part of the profits for himself in what historians have described as a form of institutionalized corruption within the SS system itself. At least 50,000 Jews were forced to work in these camps. In the fall of 1943, when the Schmelt organization was dissolved, most of its prisoners were deported directly to Auschwitz for extermination. The remaining camps were absorbed by the Gross-Rosen concentration camp. In the occupied Polish and Soviet territories between 1939 and 1944, the German authorities established between 750 and 800 forced labor camps for Jews, in which at least 263,000 men, women and children were exploited. They worked in the construction of roads, airfields, bridges and dams, in agriculture and in the arms industry. They were under the supervision of the respective higher SS and police leaders, Höhere SS und Polizeiführer, or the German civil administration. In the Reich Commissariat for Ukraine, Jews worked on the construction of the planned Durchgangsstraße 4, the great transit road to the east. When a section was completed, the SS units executed the workers. Then the next section would begin. Most prisoners in these labor camps were deported and killed in extermination camps in the summer and fall of 1943 as part of the operation that the Nazis called Action Erntefest, Harvest Festival, carried out on November 3rd and 4th, 1943 in the camps of Majdanek, Troniki and Poniatowa, with an estimated toll of 43,000 killed in 2 days. The children's camps, Moringen, Uckermark and Łódź. Within the Nazi terror system, there existed a category of facilities that most Holocaust documentaries systematically avoid, not out of ignorance, but due to an instinctive form of self-protection against what is hardest to comprehend. The Jugendschutzlager, youth protection camps, a euphemism that in SS language referred to concentration camps for minors, in Moringen and Uckermark, and the Polen Jugendverwahrlager. Police custody camp for Polish youth in Łódź existed. They operated for years and children died in them. The Jugendschutzlager in Moringen in Lower Saxony was opened in August 1940 in the facilities of a former correctional home. Its population consisted of boys and young men aged 13 to 22, although in practice, younger children were also interned there. The categories for admission were deliberately broad: incorrigibility, antisocial behavior, repeated vagrancy, resistance to education, juvenile delinquency, anti-state behavior. In practice, these categories included the children of arrested communists and trade unionists, young people who had refused to join the Hitler Youth, members of alternative youth groups, the Edelweiss-Piraten, Edelweiss Pirates, young workers of the Rhine who organized into gangs of passive and active resistance, and Romani adolescents who were considered by racial doctrine to be irredeemably antisocial by definition. Upon entering the camp, the youths were subjected to an assessment called a criminobiological examination, conducted by the SS Biological Criminology Institute under the supervision of Dr. Robert Ritter, who had built his academic career studying hereditary criminality in the Romani population. This examination, a combination of physical heredity measurements, phrenological, rudimentary psychological tests, and collection of information about family history, determined whether a young person was biologically recoverable or biologically degenerate. Those who received the latter rating were transferred to adult concentration camps, where the likelihood of survival was incomparably lower. Those who received the former rating remained in Moringen under a regime of forced labor and re-education, the brutality of which depended on the guards' moods. The Jugendschutzlager in Uckermark in Brandenburg was opened in June 1942, adjacent to the Ravensbruck camp, sharing administrative facilities with it and using the same procedures. It housed young women between the ages of 16 and 21, under the same categories of anti-social behavior as Moringen. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, when Ravensbruck implemented mass selection for the gas chamber, the prisoners from Uckermark were included in the process. The young women from the auxiliary camp were transferred to Ravensbruck to be murdered. The transition from the youth protection camp to the gas chamber required only an administrative form. The Polen-Jugendverwahrlager of the security police in Litzmannstadt, the camp on Przemysłowa Street in Łódź, colloquially called Kinder-KZ Litzmannstadt, was established in December 1942 by an order signed by Himmler on November 28th of that year. Himmler's directive described the camp as a facility for Polish adolescents, criminal or abandoned, and explicitly referred to the moral risk that Polish children would pose to German children if they were left free. The location was deliberately chosen. The camp was built on land adjacent to the Łódź Jewish ghetto, separated only by a wooden fence, justified on the grounds that the ghetto already had security infrastructure and that the land could be expanded as the ghetto was liquidated. The official age for admission was initially set at 8 years, then reduced to 6. Documentation from the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, which has conducted excavations at the former campsite since the 2000s, found remains of children younger than that age. The most disturbing records include the documented presence of 2-year-old children. They were children of detainees, in many cases children of Poles arrested for resistance activities or deported to labor camps, who arrived at the camp because there was no other place to put them once their parents had been detained. The camp also received children arrested directly from the streets for minor offenses, asking for food, stealing low-value items, wandering without adult supervision. Living conditions within the camp were of extreme deprivation. Food was insufficient even for a sedentary adult. Children slept in wooden bunk beds with inadequate blankets during Polish winters. Forced labor included sewing, children made textile garments, and maintenance work around the camp itself. Infectious diseases, typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, spread unchecked and without effective medical care. Those who turned 16 were transferred to forced labor camps for adults in Germany. Camp records indicate that between 2,000 and 3,000 children passed through its facilities between December 1942 and January 1945. Camp discipline was in the hands of German guards, among whom the most documented in subsequent trials were Eugenia Pohl and, above all, the guard Sima Bayer. Testimonies collected in post-war Polish trials describe Bayer beating children with whips and sticks until they lost consciousness, then pouring cold water on them so they could regain awareness and continue receiving punishment. A girl, Teresa Jakubowska, died after being beaten by Bayer. Testimonies from Zofia Soap and Emila Mocek, who had been in the girls' camp in the parallel Dzierżoniezna facility, describe how they were forced to line up and watch the punishments. Bayer was tried in 1945 by a Polish court and sentenced to death. The type of punishment Bayer applied if children wet the bed, exposure to the cold outside in the snow for prolonged periods, is documented in multiple testimonies. The bodies of children who died in the camp were buried in the St. Wojciech Cemetery in Łódź. Archaeological excavations carried out by the Polish Institute of National Remembrance in successive series since the 2000s have exhumed identifiable remains of at least 77 children in that cemetery, with estimated ages between 2 and 16 years. DNA and forensic anthropology analyses continue. Identification work is progressing slowly because the deliberate destruction of camp records in January 1945, as the Red Army approached, left most victims undocumented. When Soviet troops entered Łódź on January 19, 1945, they found approximately 850 children alive in the camp in various stages of malnutrition and illness. The city's communist administration demolished the camp remains in 1947 to build a socialist and optimistic neighborhood. The only existing memorial for decades was a sculpture inaugurated in 1971, a nude youth before a broken heart, which for years was visited almost exclusively by survivors, a group that diminished every year. Camps in Western Europe and the invisible network. The Nazi terror system in Western Europe differed in form but not in function from the Eastern system. The facilities in Western Europe, transit camps, police camps, expanded prisons, were nodal points of a logistical network connecting local detention with extermination in the East. Every city in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Italy or Greece with a Gestapo office had its own route leading with more or fewer stops to the ramps of Auschwitz or Sobibor. The difference between East and West was not intensity but distance. The Westerbork camp had a pre-war history that set it apart from any other facility in the system. In 1939, the Dutch government built it with funds from the Jewish community of the Netherlands to house Jewish refugees arriving from Germany fleeing Nazism. It was, in its origin, an act of humanity. The historical irony that the same camp was later converted into the main deportation node for Dutch Jews did not escape those who lived through it. Philip Mechanicus, a Dutch journalist who passed through Westerbork before being deported and killed, recorded it in his diary with a laconic precision that makes any added commentary unnecessary. When the SS took control of Westerbork in July 1942, the camp already had functioning infrastructure, barracks, administration, basic services, and a population of privileged German Jews who had been there for years and held positions in internal administration. This circumstance created one of the most disturbing social anomalies in the entire system. It was the German Jews of the camp themselves, who spoke the occupiers' language, had relative access to administration, and could temporarily influence the lists, who managed the weekly selection process. They decided within the limits imposed by the SS who would board Tuesday's train. Tensions between the German and Dutch Jewish populations within the camp were intense and are widely documented in the diaries and memoirs of survivors. The camp commander from October 1942 was SS Obersturmführer Albert Konrad Gemmeker, who managed Westerbork with a combination of calculated paternalism and bureaucratic coldness that survivors' testimonies describe as more disturbing than overt cruelty. Gemmeker actively promoted cultural life within the camp: symphony orchestra, weekly cabaret, variety theatre. The artists who performed in the camp cabaret found in this a temporary protection from deportation. Gemmeker valued them and delayed their inclusion on the lists. The comedian Max Ehrlich and the composer Willy Rosen performed week after week for Gemmeker and his staff. Both were eventually deported. Rosen died in Bergen-Belsen. The Jewish photographer Rudolf Breslauer was tasked by Gemmeker to film camp life to present documentation of good functioning to his superiors. The resulting film, preserved and classified in the UNESCO Memory of the World Register, includes images of children being loaded onto train cars, the only filmed sequence of a deportation to an extermination camp that survived the war. Breslauer was deported to Auschwitz in early 1945 and died there. Between July 1942 and September 3, 1944, 103 convoys departed from Westerbork with 97,776 registered people, 54,930 to Auschwitz in 68 transports, 34,313 to Sobibor in 19 transports, 4,771 to Theresienstadt in 7 transports, and 3,762 to Bergen-Belsen in 9 transports. The train of the last transport on September 3, 1944, carried among its passengers Anne Frank, her sister Margot, and their father Otto. It was the last transport to leave Westerbork. Allied troops were already on Belgian soil, and the railway network was beginning to collapse under bombings. Anne and Margot Frank died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen in March 1945. Otto Frank survived Auschwitz and was the only passenger of that last convoy to return to the Netherlands. The Mechelen camp, SS Samenlige Mecheln in the German nomenclature, Kaserne Dossan in Belgian history, operated in the facilities of the Dossan barracks, in the centre of the Flemish city of Mechelen, halfway between Brussels and Antwerp. It was established under the orders of SS Hauptsturmführer Philipp Schmidt in July 1942, simultaneously with the activation of the deportation system in Belgium. The original barracks, built for military use, were not substantially adapted. Prisoners slept in the barracks rooms, on the floor, or on improvised bunk beds, with a density that increased as arrivals accelerated. The camp had its own kitchens and a rudimentary hospital, but the average stay was so short that medical facilities mattered little to the deportees. Most spent only the strictly necessary days in Mechelen to complete the quota for a transport. Between August 4, 1942 and July 31, 1944, 28 convoys departed from Mechelen with a total of 25,437 people to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The largest transported 1,742 people. The 17th convoy, on April 19, 1943, was the subject of the only documented sabotage action against a deportation train in Western Europe. A group of 3 young Belgian Jews, including Jura Livchitz, a 25-year-old doctor, intercepted the train in motion in a rural section northeast of Brussels and opened the wagon locks with levers, allowing between 230 and 250 people to jump from the moving train. Of these, 115 were recaptured and later deported. About 20 died from the jump or from guards' gunfire. The rest managed to escape. Livchitz was arrested months later for resistance activities and executed in February 1944. The Drancy camp, on the outskirts of Paris, was France's largest transit facility. The building that housed it was an unfinished social housing development, the Cité de la Muette, City of the Mute, designed by architects Marcel Lodz and Eugène Baudouin in 1933. It consisted of 5 large, linear concrete blocks arranged in a U-shape around an open courtyard, intended to house Parisian working-class families. When in August 1941 the French authorities converted it into an internment camp under German supervision, the blocks still lacked finished windows, complete sanitary facilities, or functional heating. Prisoners arriving in the winter of 1941 to 1942 lived in these conditions, effectively outdoors, until the camp administration carried out minimal improvements. Drancy's administrative particularity in its early years was that it was managed exclusively by the French police, the Gendarmerie Nationale, under German supervision. The SS did not take direct control until July 1943, when SS Obersturmführer Alois Brunner, the same man who later coordinated the deportations from Salonika and Vienna, was appointed commander. Brunner introduced a harsher regime and implemented systematic body searches that the previous French administration had not adopted to the same extent. Prisoners arriving at Drancy under Brunner's management were subjected to total confiscation of valuables, which the French administration had carried out more leniently. Brunner was tried in absentia by French and German courts after the war. He took refuge in Syria, where he lived under government protection until his death at an unspecified date sometime in the 2000s. He was never extradited. The Italian network had as its most significant facility the Risiera di San Saba in Trieste, the only facility on Italian soil with a crematorium, established by the SS in October 1943 after Mussolini's fall and the German occupation of northern Italy. The building was a former rice factory whose drying oven was adapted for cremation. It served to detain and execute Slovenian and Croatian partisans, Italian resistance fighters, and as a transit point for the deportation of Jews from northeastern Italy to the eastern camps. The Risiera was the only Italian facility prosecuted in Italy after the war. The trial began in 1976 and concluded with in absentia convictions of several SS officials. In Norway, the Grini camp, located on the outskirts of Oslo in the facilities of a former women's prison, was the main detention facility for Norwegian citizens. At its maximum capacity, it housed over 6,000 prisoners, mostly resistance members, officials, and Jews. From Grini and from the port of Oslo, ships departed that deported Norwegian Jews. The most famous was the transport of the ship Gotenland in November 1942 and that of the cargo ship Gotenland. In total, approximately 770 Norwegian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. 95% of them died. In Greece, the Chaidari camp, located in a barracks on the outskirts of Athens, initially under Italian administration and then German from September 1943, served as a gathering point for the deportations of Jewish communities from the Aegean and Dodecanese islands. Jews from Corfu, Rhodes, Kos, and other islands, in some cases communities established for centuries, were deported in the summer of 1944, many on barges that transported them to the mainland to then be loaded onto trains to Auschwitz. The Jews of Rhodes arrived at Auschwitz in August 1944 after a journey of over 2 weeks that included 3 days on open boats at sea. Most were killed upon arrival. The network was, in its entirety, the product of logistical coordination involving the Reich Ministry of Transport, the Reichsbahn Railway Company, the various police apparatuses of the occupied territories, local collaborators in each country, and Eichmann's office in the RSHA, which centralized transport planning. This coordination was not a product of chaos or improvisation. There were conferences, memoranda, spreadsheets of costs per kilometer and per deportee. The official price that the Reichsbahn charged for transporting Jews to the extermination camps was equivalent to the third-class group train fare. Children under 4 traveled free. Those between 4 and 10 paid half fare. The witnesses and memory. The history of the camps cannot be reduced to numbers and regulations. Soligana was born in 1928 in Heidekrug, Lithuania. After the German troops entered in June 1941, he was interned with his family in the Kaunas ghetto and later in the Stutthof concentration camp near Danzig. In August 1944, he was transferred with his father to one of the Dachau sub-camps in the Kaufering-Landsberg area. In the spring of 1945, he was put on a death march toward Dachau. He described the end of that march in his memoirs, the moment when, lying in the snow, he saw a tank appear on the road and heard a soldier say to him in English, kneeling beside him, that he was free. Ganor was 16 years old. His father had died on the march hours earlier. Lena Haag, born into a working-class family in Württemberg, was arrested in 1933 along with her husband Alfred, a communist deputy in the Württemberg State Parliament. Alfred was sent to Dachau. Lena went through Germany's first women's concentration camp, KZ Gottesel in Schwäbisch Gmünd, set up in an old prison inside a convent, and then through Lichtenburg, a Renaissance castle in Pretin on the banks of the Elbe near Torgau, which was the precursor of the Ravensbruck camp. Haag wrote her memoirs in the form of a letter to her husband, whom she did not see during the entire Nazi dictatorship. She lived over 100 years. In her last interviews, she retained a sharp and intact political memory. The camp existed in thousands of forms. It existed as the Treblinka extermination camp, where there was no return possible. It existed as the Dachau sub-camp in St. Gilgen, where an SS commander used prisoners to build himself a villa by the lake. It existed as the Łódź ghetto, where workshops produced German military uniforms in the hope of survival. It existed as the Drancy camp on the outskirts of Paris, with its unfinished windows open to the winter wind. It existed as the Risiera di San Saba in Trieste and as the Chaidari camp in the suburbs of Athens. It existed above all as a deliberate project of a modern civilization that chose to use its most sophisticated tools, bureaucracy, engineering, industrial management, statistics, in the service of the most methodical crime in history. The perpetrators were not demons, they were administrators, and that is perhaps the hardest truth to bear.